Some time ago in Christmas time, I received a gift of a book which is titled Character is Destiny, where the author tells 34 stories of different people who had just admirable qualities. And I was reading about the resilience of Abraham Lincoln. And as I was reading his story, it struck me how much he could identify with Jesus. The experiences that he had, both of them suffered an extraordinary amount. And part of our scripture reading, it referred to Jesus as the man of sorrows, who is acquainted with grief. And I would like to deepen our appreciation for what Jesus has done for us by reflecting on the experience of Abraham Lincoln. You may not have read his story recently, and maybe you didn't know these things, but he was a man who struggled with depression. And he had significant losses in his life. When he was 9 years old, his 34-year-old mother passed away. When he was 3, his newborn brother, at 3 days, expired. And then when he was 19 years old, his older sister, who was 2 years older than she passed away while giving birth at the age of 21 to her baby. So there were reasons why Abraham Lincoln struggled with this issue. On top of those things, well, he was fortunate enough, I should say, to have if you can say that there's a wonderful replacement to your mother. I mean, who can be your mother better than your mother? But his dad went, and he knew of this woman. I don't know what took him 14 months to do this, but he showed up on her doorstep. He knew that she was a widow. She had 3 children, and he proposed to her as soon as the door opened. And he said he was going to pay her bills that her husband had for her. I don't know if that had something to do with it or not. But she was a wonderful substitute, if you please, to him. She encouraged him. She became as dear to him as his own mother was. Well, in his 20s, he had other issues that contributed to his melancholy spirit, if you please. I don't know if you remember the name of Anne Rutledge, but they were planning on getting married. He was 26, she was 22, and she was attacked by typhoid fever and passed away shortly thereafter. In 1836, the next year, he had a courtship with Mary Owens, and Abraham struggled with depression, and because of that, he had a severe depression, and he asked her to marry, this Mary Owens, he asked to marry her, and he had another episode of depression, and she decided she wasn't going to marry him, so that broke his heart as well. Well, in 1839, Mary Todd, he was engaged to her, but he broke off his relationship with her. But what you may not know, well, you know that there's nobody as honest as Abraham Lincoln. He must have reflected back on that and felt, I'm a man of my word. I need to keep my promises. If I asked her to marry me, I should follow through with that. So he did. But unfortunately, it was a loveless marriage to which he was bound. So he had these childhood experiences. He had these experiences as a 20-something and early 30s. And to their union were born 4 boys. Robert in 1843, Edward in 1846, Willie in 1851, and Tad in 1853. 3 of the boys died at 3 years old, 11 years old, and 18 years old. So he had more fodder for his depression, I'm sure. And Willie was the one who he seemed to connect with the most. He was most like Abraham Lincoln. He was the brightest. He loved to read. And they spent a lot of time together. Even though he was president, he would try to create space so that he could play with Willie and the youngest brother. Well, in 1862, 2 weeks, Willie had been struggling with an illness, and it finally got to him and took him out. So at 11 years old, Abraham Lincoln lost, if you could say, his favorite son. We shouldn't have favorites, I guess, but he did, and it just was decimating. He went to his office and informed his secretary, John Nicolay, "My boy is gone. He's actually gone. We loved him so. It is hard to have him die." Well, a witness of Lincoln's grief offered this sad portrait of the grief-stricken president. Quote, "He was his father's favorite. They were intimates, often seen hand in hand, and there sat the man with a burden on the brain at which the world marvels, bent low with the load of both heart and brain, staggering under a blow like the taking from him of his child." Of course, the brain burden that he had, he was in the process of managing, if you could call it that, the Civil War. And I don't know how can anything be more grievous than losing family members? And of course, none of us have had that responsibility, but it must have been a horrible burden to bear. Some even thought that Abraham Lincoln wasn't fit to be president. He was just a country hick. And Lincoln even thought when his first term expired, he didn't think he was going to be reelected. His former law partner and friend described Lincoln as a sad-looking man. His melancholy dripped from him as he walked. Lincoln himself described to another law partner the symptoms of a depression he suffered after he had broken off his engagement with Mary Todd and felt torn between guilt over his broken promise and the bleakness of potentially loveless marriage. He said, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better." Then there was the war that he had to manage. It was the bloodiest war in our history. The North lost 364,000 men, 275,000 were wounded. The South lost 256, and a similar number have been injured, which totals over 1 million Americans that lost their lives in this civil strife. And it just seemed like tragedy after tragedy after tragedy happened. South Carolina seceded from the Union about 6 weeks after Lincoln was elected president. A month later, he was inaugurated president. The South fired on Fort Sumter. 5 days later, Virginia secedes, and 3 months later, the North experiences their first defeat at Bull Run. 13 months later was their second defeat at Bull Run. And a month later, Lee was finally stopped at Antietam, where 26,000 perished. It was the bloodiest day in U.S. history. But it was on December 5, 1862, that one of his closest friends was killed in the war. A number of mutual friends approached Lincoln and asked him if he wouldn't approach this gentleman's 22-year-old daughter, Fannie McCullough, who he had held in his lap when she was just a tiny girl. Lincoln was only 3 months beyond the bloodiest day of the war and 10 months beyond the loss of his beloved son, Willie. But if you can, in your imagination, think about all that he went through and what this girl was experiencing, there was probably no one better equipped to identify with her, to resonate with her, to let her know that somebody else understood. And so he composed this letter, December 23, 1862. He wrote, "Dear Fanny, it is with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father, and especially that it is affecting your young heart beyond what is common in such cases. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. I'm anxious to afford some alleviation to your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize that you will feel better. Is not this so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say, and you need only to believe it to feel better at once. Please present my kind regards to your afflicted mother, your sincere friend, A. Lincoln." Well, all the losses that Abraham Lincoln, and maybe there's somebody who had more melancholy than he did, I don't know. They haven't come into my radar. But from what we've listened to, it would be a rare find to find somebody that could be more pained, more depressed, more discouraged than Abraham Lincoln. But I think we would all agree that with all that Jesus has gone through, that it's prepared him to meet us at our lowest point. He isn't one who's going to pass away. He's not one who's going to fade away. He's going to be present for us when we might feel overwhelmed by discouragement and depression. The enemy certainly made sure that Jesus was attacked with scorn, with rejection from the very start of his ministry. Isaiah the gospel prophet predicted he would be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. With so much riding on his shoulders, much more than any other leader, the pressure must have been even greater, especially with his awareness of man's condition and how hopeless it would be without him. And what eventually Jesus went through on the cross convinced his followers of the depth of his love and his commitment to them. This would raise them above any opposition they would face. It would lift them above the greatest discouragement. It would raise them from the pit of the deepest depression. In the scripture passage in Luke chapter 22, verses 43 through 44, we're given a glimpse of how Jesus was lifted up above the horrible pit of despair that he was facing. It simply reads, this was in the Garden of Gethsemane, an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly. His sweat was like drops of blood falling on the ground. And if you read the parallel passage from the Desire of Ages on the Gethsemane experience, she writes, Christ's agony did not cease, but his depression and discouragement left him. This is when the angel came and strengthened him. The storm had in no wise abated, but he who was its object was strengthened to meet its fury. He came forth calm and serene. A heavenly peace rested upon his blood-stained face. He had borne that which no human being could ever bear, for he had tasted the sufferings and death for every man. As you've read through this passage, I don't know if it happened to you as it happened to me, but it reminded me of another passage where Jesus was struggling. It was the very beginning of his ministry when he was tested for 40 days. We don't really grasp, I think, how much this impacted him. In that account, it shares the idea that an angel came and strengthened him then. Well, if that was the case, Jesus must have been in anguish in that experience as well. He must have felt beaten down by all the pressure. all the accusations that the enemy threw in his face. In a variety of translations, it says the devil left Jesus and angels came and took care of him. The New Century Version. In today's English version, it says, then the devil left Jesus and the angels came and helped him. I mean, he's a strong man. He was a carpenter. He hadn't been in ministry. He'd been working in the carpenter shop. Have you shaken hands with our carpenter? He's very nice to us. He doesn't put the full pressure, but he could. Jesus was as strong as a carpenter. He was a carpenter. And for this man to be beaten down like he was, requiring angels to come and strengthen him, we must believe that he had gone through something, I don't know if you could say it was equal, but certainly parallel. In the Desire of Ages, she describes the experience he had. After the foe had departed, Jesus fell exhausted to the earth, with the pallor of death upon his face. The angels of heaven had watched the conflict, beholding their loved commander as he passed through inexpressible suffering to make a way of escape for us. He had endured the test, greater than we shall be called to endure. The angels now ministered to the Son of God as he lay like one dying. He was strengthened with food and comforted with the Father's message of love and assurance that all heaven triumphed in his victory. Warming to life again, his great heart goes out in sympathy for man, and he goes forth to complete the work he has begun, to rest not until the foe is vanquished and our fallen race redeemed. Well, before this Gethsemane experience, Jesus was in the upper room with his disciples, and they were involved in conflict, unfortunately, and Jesus waited for things to settle down, to become clear. But nobody picked up the challenge. Nobody took the hint. And so Jesus, rather than scolding them for being bullheaded or whatever name you might want to apply to the disciples in this experience, he simply picked up the pan of water and the towel, and he began to wash the disciples' feet. We don't know, but I wonder myself if there was, what kind of impact was made in the disciples' minds as they watched Jesus do the very thing that they should have been doing themselves. Did their smallness of mind, smallness of heart come to focus? Did they make any connection between the washing of their feet and the cleansing of their heart that needed to take place? Well, we may not be caught up in the jockeying for position like they were, but the enemy has his way to penetrate our barriers, to implode our situation, so things can come crashing down around us. I don't know if you're one who has struggled with discouragement, with depression. It's not beyond his ability to care for that, is it? We don't usually talk about that when we're visiting with one another. We have secrets we keep. We don't want people to know what we struggle with. Others may have other issues that they struggle with. We don't need to enumerate them all. Each of us knows what issues we struggle with. Jesus is not unmindful of what we deal with. And he wants to cleanse us, just like he wanted to cleanse the disciples. Not just our feet, not just externally, but in our heart.